Star Walker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. Hello, fellow gamer. Welcome to episode 207 of Game Master's Journey. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. On this show, we discuss the craft and the art of game mastering. I've been running RPGs for over 26 years now, and I produce this show in the hopes that you can benefit from my experience, my triumphs, and my mistakes. Today, I am returning to my series of discussion episodes on the Dungeon Master's Guide for 5th edition. Today, I am going to be talking about random encounters. So it's really great to get back to a discussion episode. I've been working so hard on getting the actual play episodes out to you. It just feels like forever since we've done one of our good old-fashioned discussion episodes. So like I said, I'm getting back into the DMG today. And let's see actually where we are. We're in chapter 3. So we're going to be continuing our discussion of chapter 3 today, talking about the section on random encounters, how to use random encounters, why to use random encounters, making random encounter tables, and all that good stuff. And of course, I will give my own personal opinion on random encounters, or as I like to call them, flexible encounters, and kind of tell you where I'm coming from when it comes to random encounters. It's kind of funny, but random encounters can be a very kind of hot topic for game masters, because there are game masters that love using random encounters. There are game masters who hate random encounters and refuse to use them. And even from game master to game master, there are very different understandings of what a random encounter is, how you use them, whether you use them, and all that stuff. So we're going to dig into that today and try to shed some light on that subject, so that you as a GM can decide how or if you want to use random encounters in your games. But before we crack open the DMG and we get into random encounters, I do have a few other things I want to discuss here at the top of the show. All right, so first off, I want to let you know that we now have a forum for the Game Master's Journey community. So we have had a community for Game Master's Journey on Google Plus for years now, but we now also have a forum, and we also have a Discord server that you can use to connect and network with other listener GMs. So go to the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey. You can find a link to our new forum. You can find a link to our Discord server, and you can find a link to our community on Google Plus. And I really hope to see you there. Also, I want to give a huge thank you and shout out to brand new patron of the show, Russell Brinson. Thank you so much, Russell. And thank you to all of the patrons of Game Master's Journey. Now, as you may or may not know, producing this show, Game Master's Journey, is just one of many things I do. It's just one of many of my hobbies. I love playing RPGs. I love running RPGs, and producing this show has just become very much a part of that whole hobby for me. You know, when it comes to tabletop RPGs, I run them, I play them, and I also talk about them on the show. And, you know, part of why I do this show is just because I enjoy talking about RPGs, and I especially enjoy when I can have guests on the show and talk with other GMs about whatever we want to talk about RPG related. But another reason, a big reason I make this show, is I hope that it can be a resource for newer GMs, less experienced GMs, maybe players who are thinking about trying game mastering for the first time, and also more experienced GMs. I mean, I say it in every episode. I've been running RPGs for 26 years, and I still learn new things about how to be the best game master I can be all the time, almost every week, almost every time I run a game, almost every time I listen to or watch an actual play of a game on a podcast or on YouTube. Almost every time I learn something new about some new strategy I can try, some different way I can try doing something, a new idea for an adventure or a monster or an encounter or whatever. So even after, going on almost 3 decades of running games myself, I'm still learning new things all the time. So I don't think a show like this is just for new GMs or GM wannabes or less experienced GMs. I think it's also useful for, the old guys like me that have been doing it for a long time. We all have different styles, different ways of running our games, and we can learn a lot from each other. So that's a big reason that I make this show. I want it to be a resource for you. And, like I said, I have a lot going on in my life, and every year, every month, every week, it gets harder and harder to carve out the time to make this show. And so part of the way that I can do that is by having this show bring in some kind of revenue so that at the very least it can support itself. At the very least, it can cover the costs of maintaining the website and the domain cost and the hosting cost and just the massive time cost that it takes to produce these episodes and to produce the actual plays and everything else that I do. And, that all takes time and some of it actually takes money to do. I have to pay for software every month to produce the show. I have to pay for equipment. And speaking of which, I'm going to have to do some upgrades to equipment sometime in the future. For instance, the computer I use to produce this show is getting really long in the tooth, and it's getting harder and harder for it to handle the demands that I put on it, especially when it comes to editing video content. It really bogs down. So there's a lot of expenses involved in producing the show. So at the very least, I like to find ways for the show to kind of pay for itself, so I'm not having to pay money out of pocket. And I also like to find ways for this show to generate revenue so that I can justify spending more time on the show and so that I actually can spend more time on the show. So through the years that I've been podcasting, I've tried various strategies to bring in revenue, and you can find a lot of that stuff on my support page at starwalkerstudios.com support. There's things like I have an Amazon referral link you can use. I have a Patreon, which is probably the biggest source of revenue for Starwalker Studios right now. I have ads on the website. I have ads on my YouTube videos. So there's all these different strategies that I've tried. Strategies I've tried in the past that I don't do anymore. I've had sponsors on the show before, and, always trying to find like that magic silver bullet that's going to, bring in the revenue that I need to make this happen, while at the same time keeping the quality of the show high and not annoying you, the listener, with a bunch of going on about my Patreon or a bunch of ads, whether it's in the show or on the website or whatever. So every once in a while, you have to reevaluate what you're doing, what's working, what's not working. And, there's just been a lot going on lately. We had the kind of the scare at the end of 2017 with Patreon, where they were going to change how they were charging patrons, and it was going to cost patrons a lot more, especially patrons that were pledging smaller amounts like $1 or something like that. And, they backed away from that. But it was just kind of a reminder, kind of a wake up call for all of us creators who use Patreon that, we're playing in someone else's playground. And at the end of the day, we don't really have any control over anything. I mean, Patreon could go belly up tomorrow and there's no recourse for us. And now we don't have that anymore. Or they could make some crazy change to how they do things. And we really have no say. We really have no control over that. There's been a lot of issues with YouTube lately, and you may be unaware of it, or you may be very unaware of it. And I don't want this to take too long, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. But suffice it to say that YouTube is doing various things that's making it very difficult or even impossible for smaller channels, smaller creators who don't have hundreds of thousands or millions of subscribers to make any kind of revenue using advertising or anything like that. And I've been dealing with a lot of hassles with this myself. And a lot of it seems downright crooked or shady, if not flat out illegal. Unfortunately, I don't have the means to hire attorneys and go after YouTube. And again, it's a thing where you're playing in someone else's sandbox and you really have no say or control over anything. And, frankly, unless you have thousands upon thousands or millions of subscribers, YouTube doesn't care about you. I've tried to talk with their customer service about various issues, and they basically just tell me that they are not going to look into it. They're not going to do anything about it. And I just have to live with it, basically, because my channel isn't big enough for them to care about me. They just care about these huge channels. And it didn't so much used to be that way, but it's getting more and more like that as things go on. So that's a big part of it. And a big part of it is I don't know. I feel like it kind of undermines the quality of this show when I'm, talking about my Patreon or I'm having advertisements or whatever else. And it's like right now, here we are. I'm talking about something that really has nothing to do with RPGs. It has to do with this show, right? So I am going to try some new strategies. I'm going to try some new things. And what does this mean for you, the listener? Well, I think it's going to end up being a much better experience for you as a listener. One of the strategies I was trying to try to bring in more revenue for the show was putting older episodes behind a quote paywall, which is to say, I only had 100 or so episodes available in the public feed, and the older episodes were only available to patrons, and nobody got access to them other than patrons. And ever since I started doing that, it's bothered me a little bit because, like I said, one of the goals of this show is to be a resource for GMs. And it's kind of hard to be a resource for GMs when over half of the episodes you don't have access to. I mean, there's a lot of fantastic episodes in the early seasons, in the first 100 episodes of Game Master's Journey, that a lot of my newer listeners have probably never heard. So, I evaluated what was going on. I looked at my revenue from, for instance, Patreon over the last few years. And when I made this change and I started archiving episodes and putting them behind the paywall, short term, I did see an increase in patrons, but looking at my Patreon over the course of the entire show, for a long time, it's been pretty much flat. It's plateaued. I gain patrons, I lose patrons, but overall it stayed pretty stable since long before I started archiving episodes. So in the long term, it didn't really seem to have much impact. So I feel like I'm kind of shooting myself in the foot. So what this means is I am in the process right now of re-releasing the old episodes of Game Master's Journey. So unfortunately, my hosting provider, that my website, Squarespace, is who hosts my website. They only allow you to have 100 episodes in an RSS feed. And there's nothing I can do about that other than to move my website somewhere else, which I can't do right now. So there still will only be 100 episodes in the feed. So if you're subscribed on iTunes or through an app or whatever, you're still unfortunately only going to have access to 100 episodes in that feed. And those will be the most recent episodes of the show, as well as some listener favorites, kind of the greatest hits of Game Master's Journey, if you will, because I do have metrics of how many downloads I get per episode. So I know what the most popular episodes are. So some of the older episodes that were really popular, I will make sure are in that feed. But it's just a maximum of 100 episodes, and there's nothing I can do about that right now. However, the rest of the episodes will be on my website at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey. You'll be able to go to the website. You'll be able to listen to or download all the episodes, all the way to episode 1 of Game Master's Journey. Now, at the time you're listening to this, you're probably not going to be able to get everything. The feed will be up to 100 full episodes by the time you hear this, but it takes a lot of time to re-upload the episodes to the website. So it's going to take some time for me to get them all back up, but eventually, as soon as I can, they'll all be available again for free to everyone. Also, I'm going to be re-releasing in a similar fashion the episodes of Game Master's Journey precursor podcast, GM Intrusions, which was a Numenera podcast. I put most of those episodes behind the paywall as well. So as I have time, I'm going to be re-releasing the GM Intrusions episodes publicly as well. So everyone will have access to all of the GM Intrusions episodes and all of the Game Master's Journey episodes. Now, GM Intrusions, there's less than 100 episodes. So those all will be in the podcast feed, however you subscribe to the podcast. But again, Game Master's Journey, there'll just be 100 episodes, the most recent and the greatest hits, but you will be able to find all of them on my website. So, of course, this means that I'm going to have to make some changes to my Patreon, because right now, one of the perks that patrons get is they get access to these episodes that other people don't get. So sometime in the near future, when I have the time, I'm going to revamp the Patreon a bit and change that up a bit, so you can check that out. So as I said, I'm going to try some new strategies to try to generate revenue for the show. And probably there will be less discussion of the Patreon in the show. Well, definitely there will be less discussion of the Patreon in the show going forward. I'm still going to have a Patreon. So for those of you that want to support me that way, you will still be able to do so. I'm not going to discontinue the Patreon or anything like that. I'm just not going to spend a lot of time on the show talking about it, because we're going to focus more on RPG content. Some other changes that I'm going to be making in the near future is I'm going to greatly reduce the number of ads on my website, because those are annoying. And honestly, I don't think what I get from the ads is really worth the annoyance to you for them to be there. And going forward, for new episodes, there won't hopefully be any ads in the show notes for the new episodes, unless I just miss one somehow. But my goal is to eventually remove advertising from StarWalkerStudios.com going forward. Also, I'm probably going to end up doing the same thing on my YouTube channel, because YouTube's basically dicking me around a lot. And I feel like my options at this point are to just suck it up and take it, or stop using YouTube, or stop caring about revenue from YouTube. So I'm going to take that third option and just stop having ads on YouTube, which will make my YouTube videos a better experience, because you won't have to wait the 5 seconds at the beginning of a video to skip the ad that probably no one watches anyway. So I don't know when or if I'll have time to go back through all the previous videos, because I have close to 400 videos on my YouTube channel now, and remove ads from the old videos. But going forward, I'm not going to be having ads on the new videos. So I will keep you posted going forward on how you can support the show and things like that. But again, I'm not going to take up a lot of time on the actual episodes doing that. And I'm still working it out. So if you have any ideas or anything, I'd love to hear from you. If you have any encouragement, I'd love to hear from you, because I got to tell you, this whole thing has been extremely frustrating and discouraging. And there have been days that I've been so close to just throwing in the towel altogether. But this is kind of my last ditch effort, my last attempt to make this whole thing work in a way that I'm happy with, that you're happy with, and that actually works. So yeah, I'd love to hear any encouragement. If you're someone that loves this show and you've been thinking, oh, someday I should let Lex know why I like the show, or that I like the show, or anything like that, this is a great time to do it, because it's been a rough few months for me. There's other crap going on personal stuff that I'm not going to go into. But if you're someone that's been thinking, oh, someday I'll do that, this would be a great time to do it, to be completely honest and blunt about it. But I'm going to keep going. I'm just going to put my head down and just do what I do and hope that it works out and hope that there's enough listeners out there who appreciate what I'm doing that I can keep my head above water over here in Star Walker Studios. So for right now, as far as what you can do right now, there are options at starwalkerstudios.com support that you can check out. Some of those don't even actually cost you any money. They're just little things you can do to help out the show. And otherwise, the best way really to encourage me or to help me to continue to be able to do this is to check out my self-published D&D adventure, The Trickster's Labyrinth, at starwalkerstudios.com. And, or you could get a Game Master's Journey t-shirt or a Trickster's Labyrinth t-shirt. And yeah, I'll have hopefully some more things going on in the near future. But for now, that's probably the best way you can help me out is buy my adventure. Cause I'd really like to do more, RPG publishing, and, the more people that show an interest by actually purchasing what I do, the more I feel, justified, doing it and taking the time to do it. All right. So I apologize for all of that. But these are some things I wanted to say, and I thought about just putting out an episode just about this, but I thought that would be kind of lame. And, so we just got it out of the way. And again, if you have any feedback, I would love to hear from you. You can email me gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. You can tweet me @LikeStarWalker, or you can reach me on our Discord, our Google Plus, or our forum. And so without further ado, we are going to move forward with the show. We're going to crack open this beautiful DMG, and we are going to talk about random encounters. All right, so today we are talking about random encounters. So this is another episode in a whole series of episodes I've been doing in which I go through the Dungeon Master's Guide page by page and discuss it with you. You can head to the show notes for this episode at starwalkerstudios.com, and I will have links to all the previous episodes in this series so you can check those out if you're a new listener and you want to get caught up. Also, I did a similar thing with the Player's Handbook. I focused on mainly the GM stuff, so I didn't so much go through individual spells or class abilities or things like that. I focus more on the rules of the game, and I'll have a link to all those episodes, or links, I should say, to all those episodes in the show notes as well. Now, I've actually talked about random encounters a lot on this show, and here are some of the previous episodes where I've talked about some of what we're going to talk about today. Episode 191, which was the 6th behind the screen episode, which was called Creating the Misty Wood Encounter Table, was all about how I created a random encounter table. So that's very relevant to what we're talking about today. Episode 176 was Random Encounters, Player Honesty, Theater of the Mind, and GM Impartialness in West March's campaigns. So that's some relevant stuff as well. And as well as the other behind the scenes, or behind the screen, I can never say it right, behind the screen episodes, which, by the way, are episodes where I'm talking about my current campaign as far as, how I'm planning it, how I'm preparing it, how I'm running it, and then, how things went and all that good stuff. So those are episodes 190, 187, 186, 185, and 184. And I will have all these episodes linked in the show notes. Just go to starwalkerstudios.com/gamemastersjourney/207 to take you directly to this episode. Also, finally, earlier this week, or I guess it's last week for you when this comes out, Wizards of the Coast released the latest Unearthed Arcana article on their website, which is a PDF that is all about a supplemental / addition, or supplemental additional. That means the same thing. Man, I'm like all over the place today. Supplemental and or alternate wilderness exploration rules. So that's kind of relevant to what we're talking about today. And I'm pretty happy with what they came up with there. So definitely go check that out as well. I'll have that linked in the show notes as well. And finally, I want to let you know, if you don't have Xanathar's Guide, or if you do, and maybe you haven't read it extensively, there are random encounter tables created for you in Xanathar's Guide. And that's in Chapter 2, Dungeon Masters Tools. And one thing I want to make sure that you notice when you're looking at these is not only do they have tables for different environments like Arctic encounters or coastal encounters or forest encounters, but each of those environments are broken up into different tables for each tier of play. So for instance, I'll just look at the first one, which is Arctic encounters. We have the first table is for tier 1 or levels 1 to 4. Second table is for tier 2, levels 5 to 10. Third table is for tier 3, 11 to 16. And then the fourth table is for tier 4, 17 to 20. So, at the time that the Dungeon Master's Guide was written, we didn't have this. So we're going to have some discussion today about how to create your own tables. And for sure, I encourage you to do so, because that's a great way, or that's a great way to customize and make it really fit your setting and the environment that your particular player characters are in. But we do now have these pre-created random encounter tables for you that can be really handy if you just need something quickly on the fly during a game session. So check that out if you have Xanathar's Guide. And if you don't have Xanathar's Guide, it's another good reason to think about getting Xanathar's Guide. I highly recommend Xanathar's Guide. It's a fantastic resource. All right, so we are picking up right where we left off in our last DMG discussion episode, in which we talked about creating encounters. And so we are starting on page 85 of the DMG, which is Chapter 3, Creating Adventures. And we're starting in the section Random Encounters. As characters explore a wilderness area or dungeon complex, they are bound to encounter the unexpected. Random encounters are a way to deliver the unexpected. They are usually presented in the form of a table. When a random encounter occurs, you roll a die and consult the table to determine what the party encounters. Some players and DMs view random encounters in an adventure as time wasters. Yet well-designed random encounters can serve a variety of useful purposes. So now we're going to go through some of the purposes that random encounters can serve in your game. And all of these are kind of an answer to the question, why on earth would I use a random encounter to begin with? So first, they can create urgency. Adventurers don't tend to dawdle if the threat of random encounters is hanging over their heads. Wanting to avoid wandering monsters creates a strong incentive to look for a safe place to rest. Rolling dice behind the DM screen can often accomplish this even without an actual encounter. And that's true. That totally works. I have run D&D and other games for so many different players, and I've never had a group where rolling dice secretly behind the screen doesn't have an impact. The players will notice you doing it, and they will react to that. And a lot of times, especially in D&D, the reaction is, oh crap, the DM's rolling for a random encounter. Uh-oh, here it comes. And it does create that sense of agency. Like they said, even if you don't roll an encounter, or even if you're just rolling dice behind the screen just to mess with the players, just the fact that they see you doing it reminds them that, hey, there's a possibility that we could get a random encounter. And the longer we screw around, or the longer we do what we're doing, or, the longer we keep doing what we're doing, or we stay in the same place, the more chance that that's going to happen. And it can be a great way to kind of spur them on when things are lagging a bit. So, everything that we talk about on this show, we talk about a lot of tools that you can use as a DM, and you want to avoid, if you can, that, the cliched thing of, now I have a hammer, so everything looks like a nail to me, right? any tool can be abused or overused or used in times that aren't appropriate. So, you want to have as many tools in your toolbox as you can. And you also want to know, the right time and place to use a particular tool in a given situation. What is the best tool to use? So random encounters can definitely be overdone. They can be overused, but sometimes they're just what the doctor ordered. So that's one thing we can use random encounters for, is to create some urgency, to keep the players going, to keep the pace of the game going, to keep it fun and exciting, and to keep people from getting bored is really the goal here. Next, random encounters can establish atmosphere. The appearance of thematically linked creatures as random encounters helps to create a consistent tone and atmosphere for an adventure. For example, an encounter table filled with bats, wraiths, giant spiders, and zombies creates a sense of horror and tells the adventurers to prepare for battle with even more powerful creatures of the night. So this is very similar to, like, if you're designing an adventure to run, how you might have kind of a theme to an adventure. Like, I did a dungeon, one of my first adventures I did in 5th edition. I did a dungeon. It was a pretty small dungeon, and it's actually, I have the session that we did this on my YouTube channel. It was the first Primordia adventure I did on my YouTube channel. And it wasn't a very big dungeon. And the thing about this dungeon was there was a lot of undead in there. And so, it wasn't all undead, but the majority of the encounters that the player characters had was some kind of undead. And that was kind of the theme of the dungeon. It's kind of pulled everything together, and there were reasons those undead were there. And so you can do the same kind of thing with your random encounter table or your random encounters that you use, is you can reinforce a theme or reinforce how this region that the player characters are in are different from, or is different from, the last region they were in. So in my campaign I'm running right now, Hinterlands of Elandria, the player characters have been adventuring in a region called the Misty Wood. And I have an encounter table that I made for that. And I talked all about how I created that in episode 191. But some things off the top of my head, there's quite a few dinosaurs on the Misty Wood encounter table, because I decided that dinosaurs are a thing in Primordia, and they're just as common as any other kind of mundane animal would be. And I really wanted to showcase that and to show the players that dinosaurs are a thing in Primordia. So I made sure that they had a strong presence on that Misty Wood encounter table. Also, the zone, if you will, to use an MMO term, of the Misty Wood is a, quote, lower level zone, which is not to say that there aren't more powerful creatures on the table. There definitely are. I know I have at least a few CR8 creatures on the table, including Tyrannosaurus Rex, which I call a Tyrannosaur in the world. I believe there's at least one dragon on the table, things like that. Because, and I think we'll talk about this more a little later, I don't think that you want to go so far as to have every encounter be level appropriate, quote, level appropriate, right? You want some encounters to be super easy. You want some encounters to be hard, and you even want some encounters that would be impossible for the player characters to face, because that's realistic and it makes your world seem more believable. Because if the players realize, and they will realize, that every encounter is within a certain CR range, it makes the world feel very contrived. It makes it feel like you're playing World of Warcraft or something, which is not what we want. We want it to be more immersive, and we want to have suspension of disbelief, and having this contrived feeling to your world directly undermines suspension of disbelief, which is to say, you want the players, as much as possible when they're playing the game, to forget that they're playing a game and forget that this is all made up, and to feel like the world is real and that it follows natural laws that make sense and that they can predict. So for those reasons, it's a good idea to have a good spread of challenge levels on your table, and to even have things that the player characters can't face. Like, for instance, a CR8 Tyrannosaur for her first level or second or third level party. And the other part of it is, and this is kind of my philosophy as a DM, different GMs have different philosophies. But again, I don't want that contrived feeling to the world. I don't want that gaminess, and I don't want metagaming at my table. And part of that for me is I want to occasionally throw a challenge at the player characters that they can't defeat, like a CR8 Tyrannosaur when they're second level, because I want the players to learn that, this is as close to a representation of a realistic seeming world as Lex can do, which means not everything you encounter in the wilderness is going to be something you can fight and defeat. Sometimes you have to run away. Sometimes you have to hide while the Tyrannosaur goes by. And that's realistic. It adds suspense and tension to your game, and it makes the players think, and it makes their characters think, and it makes them assess situations and threats instead of just charging in to fight everything that they face, assuming that it's all going to be level or CR or challenge appropriate. And I'm also pulling a lot from the West Marches style of campaign, which I've had numerous episodes discussing West Marches campaigns on this show. And that's a big feature of those campaigns as well, is that everything you face isn't going to be level appropriate. And part of the challenge of the game is being able to assess the situation and assess the threat and decide whether you can fight it or not, whether you have a hope of success and whether you want to or not. And it just adds depth to your game. I don't want to run a game where it's just assumed that everything the player characters come across, they're, quote, supposed to fight. That's another way that a game can feel, quote, railroaded, like the players don't have agency, is like, well, everything we encounter, we have to fight it. There's no way to avoid it. There's no way to overcome the obstacle in a way other than fighting. And so that's just what I go for in my games. So the Misty Wood, there's quite a few dinosaurs in the table. The player characters are soon going to venture into another region called the Fairy Forest. And guess what? There's lots of in the Fairy Forest. There's lots of Fae, right? So when I do my Fairy Forest encounters, I'm going to use a lot of Fae. And also for that reason, I didn't want to have a lot of Fae on my Misty Wood encounter table, even though there would probably be Fae there, just because I want there to be a distinction in the player's mind between the Misty Wood and the Fairy Forest. Because, let's face it, they're both wooded environments. They could seem very much the same, but by the encounters I use, I can establish a difference in the player's mind, because the players can say, well, in the Misty Wood, we did have that one encounter with that one Fae creature, but now that we're in the Fairy Forest, we're seeing Fae left and right, and it gives it a very different feel. Another thing you can use random encounters for is to drain character resources. Random encounters can drain the party's hit points and spell slots, leaving the adventurers feeling underpowered and vulnerable. This creates tension as players are forced to make decisions based on the fact that their characters aren't at full strength. And yeah, in this, depending on your style, this can be more or less helpful to you. There's definitely this GMing style of I'm trying to wear the player characters down by all these, encounters that maybe individually they're not super challenging, but they have so many of them in a row without a chance to recover their resources that it gets more and more challenging. And that's definitely a style that some GMs use. Me personally, I don't so much do that. The only time I really find that to work terribly well to begin with is in like a dungeon type environment. Because in an open world environment, there's just too many options. There's too many ways that the player characters can avoid conflict. So if you're trying to wear them down with all these encounters, it can be really frustrating and ultimately almost impossible to do, because they can always find a way to avoid the encounter or get around it or something. So it's not a strategy I highly recommend myself, but it is a possibility. Especially, like I said, in a dungeon environment, it works a little better. Another possible use for random encounters is to provide assistance. Some random encounters can benefit the characters instead of hindering or harming them. Helpful creatures or NPCs might provide the adventurers with useful information or assistance when they need it most. And yeah, and I really highly recommend when you create a random encounter table that you have at least some things or encounters on that table that are either potentially non-threatening or non-violent encounters, or are intended to be non-threatening or non-violent encounters. For instance, in one of the actual plays I just released, the player characters had an encounter with some type of fey creature in the Misty Wood. And if you've been watching on YouTube and you're caught up, then you know what that fey creature is. If you've been listening on the podcast, then you don't know yet what it is, but you'll find out soon. And that was never intended by me, the Dungeon Master, to be a combat encounter. Now, of course, it could have turned into that. The players could have made it a combat encounter, but that wasn't my intent. My intent was for it to be a non-combat encounter. And in reality, this fey creature could be a potential ally to the player characters, depending on how they play it. So, that's always a possibility as well. Another thing you can do with a random encounter is to add interest. Random encounters can reveal details about your world. They can foreshadow danger or provide hints that will help the adventurers prepare for the encounters to come. I do this all the time. I talk a lot on the show about how anytime I create an encounter, whether it's a combat encounter or a social encounter or an exploration encounter, every encounter I create has at least one purpose. And that purpose could be, this is something I want the player characters to fight so they can get some XP and get some treasure, or to impress upon them how dangerous the environment is. But sometimes the purpose is to foreshadow things that are coming later into the adventure, or to give hints about things that are going on in the environment that the player characters don't know about. Now, I don't want to tell you specifically which encounters, because I don't want to spoil anything for you or for my players that are probably listening to this. But I will tell you, in my Hinterlands of Alondria actual play, there have been numerous encounters that are either directly foreshadowing something that is to come, or are a clue, a hint about something that's going on in the environment. And, if my players are the more kind of metagaming players, which they're not, but if they were, where they're thinking of everything from a game perspective and encounters are just bags of XP and treasure that they can beat on and collect, then they're going to totally miss all that. But if they're thinking, maybe some of these things at least are happening for a reason, then they may eventually be able to put pieces together and figure out things that are going on in the background that they wouldn't know about otherwise. And a lot of my encounters that I've done so far in this campaign are exactly that. They're not, quote, random. There is a reason these things are about, and the player characters are encountering them. And this is something that the players, if they choose to investigate it, may learn some things that they might not learn otherwise until much later, or never at all. And at the very least, even if they don't investigate it, it's foreshadowing. So when they find out what's really going on later, they can be like, oh, well, that's why we encountered that thing. And that's why that other thing happened, because of this. And it all fits together and makes sense. And those are fantastic reveals. Just like in a movie, like, for instance, classic example, The Sixth Sense, right? And, I'm sure it's been long enough that I don't have to worry about spoiling The Sixth Sense for people, but there's a reveal at the end of that movie that suddenly things that happened earlier in the movie that maybe didn't make sense, or you're like, what's that about? Suddenly they make sense. And you're like, oh, now I know what's going on. One of my favorite shows right now, Star Trek Discovery, has a major reveal towards the end of the first season that we just completed, that made some things that earlier didn't make sense, or were kind of like, wait, what was that about? Suddenly they make sense now. And I'm not going to give specifics. I'm not going to spoil anything, but there's a fantastic reveal. And I really enjoyed it because I noticed those things in the earlier episodes where certain things happen. And I'm like, wait, why did that doesn't totally make sense. Why is this going on? Why is this character acting like this? It doesn't quite track with what I think should be happening. And I later found out why. And that's a really cool moment when you learn something and suddenly all these weird things in the past that didn't make sense, suddenly it all fits together and you get the clear picture and you're like, holy crap, this has been going on all along and there's been these clues and we just now put it all together. And that's a fantastic moment. And your players will remember those moments. So you can set those up. You can foreshadow those kinds of things through the random encounters that you use. And I think you'll see as we continue to discuss this, why I don't actually like the term random encounters, because I think random encounters done well, done right, aren't really random at all. Or at least a lot of them aren't, which is why I call them flexible encounters. But we'll talk more about that later. All right, so next you can use random encounters to reinforce campaign themes. Random encounters can remind the players of the major themes of the campaign. For example, if your campaign features an ongoing war between two nations, you might design random encounter tables to reinforce the ever-present nature of the conflict. In friendly territory, your tables might include bedraggled troops returning from battle, refugees fleeing invading forces, heavily guarded caravans full of weapons, and lone messengers on horseback riding for the front lines. While characters are in hostile territory, the tables might include battlefields littered with the recently slain, armies of evil humanoids on the march, and improvised gibbets holding the bodies of deserters who tried to flee the conflict. So those are just some ways that you can use random encounters and some ways that they can serve you in your campaign. Random encounters should never be tiresome to you or your players. You don't want the players to feel as if they aren't making progress because another random encounter brings their progress to a halt whenever they try to move forward. Likewise, you don't want to spend time distracted by random encounters that add nothing to the adventure narrative or that interfere with the overall pace you're trying to set. Yeah, and those are really good points. And, again, I don't really like the term random encounter usually because, like I said, a lot of my quote random encounters aren't actually random. But I'll also say that sometimes it's good to have a truly random encounter, have something just random happen that has nothing to do with the theme or the tone or isn't tied into one of the plots or storylines of your campaign, because again, that's going to add verisimilitude to your campaign. Because in life, not everything that happens has to do with what you're doing in your life or the story of your life, right? Sometimes just random things happen. And it's nice, at least once in a while in your campaign, to just have something happen that doesn't really connect to anything else. It's just something that happens. Another nice thing about that is that if every encounter in your campaign ties into a storyline or something like that, the players are going to figure that out and they're going to assume every encounter somehow ties into a storyline, even if that tie-in isn't obvious, which can lead to metagaming, can lead to the players examining something that their characters would actually never examine, but the players are examining it because they know that every encounter ties into a story. We don't see a way that this particular encounter ties into the story, but we know it has to. So we're going to dig and dig until we figure out how. And it can lead to them investigating things you don't want them to investigate, or it can lead to them investigating things that it doesn't make any sense that they would investigate. So a great way to avoid that is to just occasionally, once in a while, have an encounter that has nothing to do with anything. It's just some random thing that would be in the environment that they encounter because it makes sense that they would encounter it. Not every DM likes to use random encounters. You might find that they distract from your game or are otherwise causing more trouble than you want. If random encounters don't work for you, don't use them. And yeah, obviously that's an option. You could just not use them. But I would challenge you, if you're a GM that says, I don't use random encounters because of reasons X, Y, Z, I would challenge you to examine that. And, a lot of times those GMs, at least I've found when I talk to them, they have very limited understanding or a very limited perception or outlook on what a random encounter is and how they could use it. They've kind of got the blinders on, or they've got tunnel vision. They're thinking very narrowly. If you just open your mind a little bit, if you think about some of these things we just talked about, all the different things random encounters can do for you, all the different ways you can use them, and get over your aversion to the term random encounter or what your preconceptions of that are, I think you will find good ways to use them in your campaign that will really enhance the experience for everyone at the table. And unfortunately, I think a big problem is with the term random encounter, because it's kind of a loaded term for GMs, because a lot of us, especially GMs who've been doing this for a while, especially GMs who ran previous editions of the game that were maybe a little less enlightened, or just not less enlightened, but just a different gaming style, a more gamey way of playing the game, if you will, like in first edition or OD&D days, or even second edition or third edition. Anyway, all of the editions were gamey in their own ways. But those of us that ran those previous editions, random encounters, we can have a very kind of limited idea of what that means because of our experience in previous editions. And we're kind of missing all the opportunities and all the different ways you can use them. And again, I think that a lot of the problem is with that term random encounter, because it says it's random. And, I get it. If you're thinking that a random encounter has to be random, that you might be like, I have no use for that in my game. Although I think I just gave you a use, which is not every encounter should tie into something for the reasons that I explained. But other than that, you might think, well, there's really no use. I have no use for a random encounter. So I think the first step for a lot of us is to throw out that idea of a random encounter and think of it another way, which is why I use the term flexible encounter. So I keep throwing that term around. Let me explain it in case you haven't listened to one of the previous episodes where I've talked about this. So I have, some of those hangups myself with random encounters, although I say once in a while, a purely random encounter that has nothing to do with anything is good for your campaign. And I believe that. The key words there are once in a while, which is not to say every gaming session, which is not to say every few gaming sessions necessarily. I mean, you have to find the balance that works for you. But in general, I don't use, quote, random encounters. In general, my encounters do something. They serve a purpose other than just taking up time at the table. They may, like I said, they may foreshadow something that's coming. They may be a hint to something that's going on in the environment that the players don't know about yet. They may be a way to introduce an NPC to the player characters that they're going to need in the future, or something like that. So most of my encounters aren't random. They serve some purpose. And also I plan them ahead of time, because that's another part of the idea that a lot of people have of the random encounter, is that you literally are during play rolling to see if an encounter happens and then rolling to see what that encounter is. And personally, I very seldom do that. I will fairly often, I will roll to see if an encounter happens. But there are also times where I'm just like, oh, the PCs are going to take a long rest. I'm going to have an encounter, which a lot of people would use that, quote, random encounter there. But I'm like, it's not random because I'm choosing to have an encounter. I'm not rolling to see if one happens or not. I will sometimes roll to see if it happens, but I almost never in the moment during play roll on a table to see what the encounter is going to be. I almost always prepare those encounters ahead of time as part of my prep. And I've talked about this on the show before, but usually what I do, like for instance, right now, the player characters have been in the Misty Wood. When they first got in that region, as part of my prep, I created something like 5, quote, random encounters, or what I call flexible encounters. And these were just, I used my random encounter table I'd come up with and I didn't even really roll on the table. I just used that as, here's all the possibilities of things they might encounter in this area. And then I looked through it and picked ones that I thought would be cool encounters. And I decided, maybe how many of the things there are going to be, or sometimes I put a roll And again, I've discussed this in more detail in previous episodes, but a lot of times what I'll do is, like, let's say goblins. I decide what's the minimum number of goblins that I think would be worth doing that'll, be a fun encounter. And then what's the maximum number of goblins that I think the player characters could handle right now. And then I come up with a die roll that covers that spread. So maybe I might be like, okay, the minimum number of goblins I think is 3, any fewer than 3 goblins, and it's just going to be too much of a pushover and kind of a waste of time. And the maximum number of goblins I think the players can handle right now is 6. So my spread is 3d6. So I might say, okay, 1d4 plus 2, right? If I roll 1d4 plus 2, that's going to give me a number between 3 and 6. And so I might decide ahead of time, there's going to be 5 goblins, or I might in my notes write the PCs encounter 1d4 plus 2 goblins. And then I roll that randomly at the time that the encounter happens. So that's what I tend to do. I prepare the encounters ahead of time as far as what the encounter is, as far as who are the creatures or the NPCs that are going to be in the encounter. But I call them flexible encounters because I usually don't decide when exactly they're going to happen, and I don't decide where exactly they're going to happen. I just have those in my pocket. I literally put them on an index card. I don't actually put them in my pocket, but I have them on my DM screen. And so, like, for the Misty Wood, I had 5 of those prepared. And then anytime I either felt it was a good time to have an encounter, or any time that I wanted to roll to see if there would be an encounter, if I determined we're going to have an encounter, I would choose one of those 5 encounters. And I would just choose the one that I either felt like running right then, or I felt made the most sense for what was going on, that's what they would encounter. And I now use that flexible encounter that I pre-generated. But as far as, who the monsters are, what their stats are, what their treasure is, and all that was done ahead of time, because I don't like taking up time during the game to do that kind of stuff. And it also gives me a chance, like, for instance, if it's going to be 3 to 6 goblins, to think about, well, what might their tactics be? What kind of treasure are they going to have? What kind of weapons are they going to use? What information might they have if the player characters capture one and interrogate it, and things like that. And those are all things that you can, of course, do on the fly during play, but I like to hedge my bets and have a few of those ready. And then as I use those encounters, I'll then replace them with yet more encounters. So when the player characters venture into the fairy forest, I'll have a new group of encounters that I've pulled from my fairy forest table that are going to feature, like, more fae, for instance, that I've already prepared. So that's how I do my flexible encounters. And that's why I call them flexible, because they're not necessarily random, but they're flexible in that I can use them anytime, anywhere that I want, as long as the players are in this certain region. All right, so now let's talk about triggering random encounters. Because you want random encounters to build on the intended narrative of a game session, not compete with it, you should choose the placement of those encounters carefully. Think about a random encounter under any of the following circumstances. So these are situations when you might think, hey, maybe I'll do some kind of an encounter here. Maybe I'll do a flexible encounter here. So number 1, the players are getting off track and slowing down the game. I do this all the time. So this can happen a lot of ways. Maybe the players get on some off-topic discussion about a movie that they watched or whatever. Maybe they're planning something and they're just planning forever and kind of going in circles. Maybe just they're in camp and they don't have a clear direction of what to do, and they're just kind of spinning their wheels, and no one's really taking initiative to say, let's do this. So those are all situations where you can kind of get things moving by doing some kind of an encounter, doing a flexible encounter, pulling from your encounters you've come up with, or rolling on your table, however you want to do it. Because in this, a lot of times I find this works really well, or you'll need this at the beginning of a session. Sometimes it takes a little to get going, and it can be hard to get going when there's nothing for the player characters to react to. So maybe they're in camp and there's not really anything going on, and they're kind of taking forever to break camp and do the next thing. So you can have some kind of encounter. It could be monsters that come upon them and attack them. It could be just an NPC that comes upon their camp. Maybe it's a non-combat encounter, a way to get some information maybe, or make a new ally. But just by having that encounter and giving them something to react to, it kind of gets them going, gets them into playing the game. And then chances are better once they finish that encounter that they'll go on and do something else instead of just sitting there at camp again. Another time you might think about using a flexible or a random encounter is when the characters stop for a short or a long rest. And this is especially useful if you feel like they're resting too much, and this can really come into play in a dungeon environment, but it can happen with open world exploration as well, where, maybe you haven't planned encounters as far as your set piece encounters ahead of time, assuming that the player characters are going to be fully rested for every encounter, right? You're assuming that they're going to do more than one encounter before they take a long rest, but maybe your players are wanting to take a long rest after every single encounter. And you don't want to see that. You want there to be more attention to that, or you just don't want the adventure to take forever. So using random or flexible encounters when they take a rest can really be a help, because the players will realize, hey, every time we rest, we have an encounter, or it seems like there's a chance to have an encounter, or Lex is rolling behind the screen to see if we have an encounter. So if we just keep going, we won't have to deal with that. So it can be a way to dissuade the players if you feel like they're resting too often. And like I said, there can be different reasons you feel that way, because it's making the adventure too easy, or it's just dragging things down, or whatever. Another time you might think about using a flexible or a random encounter is when the characters are undertaking a long, uneventful journey. So, you can totally do like the travel montage where, you guys travel for a week through the wilderness and you see these interesting things and move on. But there are times you may not want to do that. And so you can break up that travel with some encounters. And, an example from my current campaign is the player characters have been traveling through the wilderness in the hinterlands of Elandria. And, I considered, because they're on a journey right now, and I considered just hand waving the journey and saying, okay, you guys get to the place that you're going to. But I decided not to do that. And the reason I don't want to do that is because part of the world of Primordia is that the wilderness is extremely dangerous. It is so dangerous that people don't leave the cities. More dangerous than your average D&D setting, because merchants don't travel between cities on roads. People don't sail from one port to another on ships. It doesn't happen because the wilderness is so dangerous. And so if I travel montage this journey and I don't do any dangerous encounters, I'm undermining that theme of my setting, which is the wilderness is dangerous. You're not going to come away feeling like the wilderness is dangerous if you go on a week-long journey and you don't have any encounters, right? And I don't want to hand wave encounters because, the characters are fairly low level. They're just got to 5th level now. So they're not so powerful that I think they could just walk through your average encounter and we don't need to play through it. So for those reasons, I don't want to just hand wave the journey. I want to have some encounters along the way to show them that, hey, yeah, it really is dangerous. And here's why, because you're facing these encounters. Another time you might think about using a flexible or a random encounter is when the characters draw attention to themselves when they should be keeping a low profile. Again, there's a perfect example of this from my campaign, from one of the recent episodes I just released on the podcast, where they just land in the Misty Wood. Their flying mounts take off to go back to the city. And as they're taking stock of the situation, one of the characters, Malagar, starts shouting into the forest, wanting to know if anybody's out there. And, a peek behind the screen, and I've discussed this on one of the behind the screen episodes. I was planning to do an encounter there anyway. I was planning to do an encounter with velociraptors at that time anyway. It was a flexible encounter that I prepared, but I was planning to do it at some point after the birds left and when they were first there, to again impress upon them that, hey, this is dangerous, to show them that dinosaurs exist in the setting, to also show them that my dinosaurs have feathers, and other things. Also as a way for them to try their combat abilities and get used to working together as a group and all these things. Again, there's multiple reasons why I do most encounters. So I was planning to do that encounter anyway. And, I've talked about this before with my flexible encounters. I'm just waiting for the perfect moment to use it, right? I've got, say, 5 encounters prepared. I don't know when or where necessarily they're going to happen, but I'm just waiting for my moment where, this encounter number 3 would be perfect right now. So Malagar is shouting in the forest. It was the golden moment to use my Velociraptor encounter I'd prepared that I was planning to do anyway. But now I have a really good reason that it happens in this particular place at this particular time, because usually being in the wilderness and making a lot of noise when there's predators around isn't a good idea. You sound like prey and they're going to come investigate. And so that's exactly what happened, was that, he shouted in the forest. There was a flock of velociraptors nearby. They came to investigate and they attacked, and we had this encounter. And then that actually led to the next encounter, which, if I remember right, was the encounter with the Fey being, because the noise of them fighting the raptors, not to mention Malagar shouting in the forest, also attracted the attention of this Fey being that was in the area. And so it came to see what was going on, and it was invisible and started following the player characters at that point and waited for its moment to have its little mischief. And again, that encounter was one I'd prepared ahead of time. I was planning to use. I didn't know when or where I was going to use it. And I was like, this is my chance for that, because it makes sense. If this being is nearby, it hears this guy screaming in the woods, which normally there's not people out here. And then it hears this loud commotion as they're fighting these velociraptors. It's curious. It's a curious Fey being. It's going to go investigate. So just one thing flows into another. It makes sense. And if the players ever stop to examine what's going on, it's going to hold up. Everything fits together. It makes sense. It makes logical sense. And again, we're building verisimilitude and trying to take away that idea of we're playing a game and we had this encounter because Lex wanted to give us XP. We don't want the players thinking like that. We want the players thinking like things are happening because the world is reacting to what we're doing. All right, so next we talk about checking for random encounters. You, the GM, decides when random encounters happen. Or you can roll. I mean, either way, you're deciding, right? Consider checking for a random encounter once every hour, or once every 4 to 8 hours, or once during the day and once during a long rest. It's up to you, however you want to do it. Whatever makes the most sense based on how active the area is. And that's how I approach it. For instance, the Misty Wood is, it's the wilderness. Yeah, it's, dangerous, but it's not as dangerous as, say, the Fairy Forest. So in the Misty Woods, maybe when they're traveling, maybe I only check for a random encounter, or I only consider running one of my flexible encounters maybe every few hours. But when they're in the Fairy Forest, I'm going to be thinking about using those flexible encounters, or I'm going to be rolling to see if they have an encounter more often. Because again, I want to impress that this is a more dangerous environment than the Misty Wood where they just came from. And so the frequency that you either check for encounters or that you use encounters can convey that. And again, you can convey that without even having an encounter, just by rolling the dice behind the screen. So maybe in the Misty Wood, the players notice like maybe once or twice in the game session, I rolled secretly behind the screen and they assume I'm rolling for encounters. But maybe once they're in the Fairy Forest, maybe I'm rolling, 5 or 6 times in a game session. And so that's going to hit home to them, and they're going to be like, oh, wow, Lex is rolling for encounters a lot more. This place is a lot more dangerous than where we just were. And of course, you can also impress that by the encounters themselves. Maybe they're more powerful monsters or there's more of them. So that can convey higher danger as well. So if you do decide to roll, the way they suggest doing it is roll a d20. And if the result is 18 or higher, then a random encounter occurs. Again, this is something you can manipulate or change based on, again, how dangerous the area is or how likely encounters are. So, 18 to 20, that's a 15% chance to have a random encounter. You could say, well, this area is really dangerous, so it's going to be 16 to 20, or maybe 11 to 20, a 50% chance. Or maybe this area is fairly settled. It's not dangerous. So there's only an encounter on a 19 or 20, or only on a 20. So, there's so many knobs and dials you can tweak here with your random or your flexible encounters to convey what you're wanting to convey, whatever that is. So once you determine that a random encounter is going to happen, you then roll on an appropriate random encounter table to determine what the adventurers meet, re-rolling if the die result doesn't make sense given the circumstances. So that's one way you can do it, or you can just pick something. That's how I tend to do it. Again, I prepare these ahead of time, and I just prepare a handful of encounters, and then I use them as needed and as appropriate. And so I make a table, or I use a table to define what the possibilities are. But then when I decide which of those possibilities I want to use, I tend not to roll. I tend to pick the ones that I think will be the most fun, the ones that I want to use because it is going to foreshadow or hint at something or something like that. Again, my encounters, I'm always trying to do multiple things with every single encounter. So, it's hard to do that if you're truly determining them randomly, but you definitely can. And that can be fun, especially when you do it at the table in the moment. Some DMs I know will let the players roll. And I would say if you're going to do it randomly, like truly randomly, if you're going to roll randomly to see if an encounter happens and or roll randomly to see what that encounter is, I'd say if you're going to do that, let the players roll the dice. That is kind of in their hands, right? Say, okay, I just determined an encounter is going to happen. Somebody roll and tell me what you roll. And then that determines the encounter. That works really well with like a West Marches type game. But if you're a GM and you're going to do it randomly, consider letting the players do that. And then, it further lets them know that you're not fudging it. And, they can't really blame you if they roll the Tyrannosaur at 3rd level and it wipes the party because they weren't smart enough to run away. So random encounter tables might be provided as part of the adventure you're running, and usually Wizards of the Coast adventures do. The latest adventure, Tomb of Annihilation, has great, really detailed random encounter tables, and they have a lot of things on there that aren't combat encounters or could be something other than a combat encounter, depending how the players approach it. So if you have any of the official adventures, you can refer to those to get ideas of how to build your own tables. So, you might have tables in the adventure you're running, or you can use the information in this chapter to build your own, or you can use the tables from Xanathar's guide. Creating your own tables is the best way to reinforce the themes and flavor of your home campaign. And I highly recommend that if you have the time to create your own tables, or at the very least create a list of possible encounters you could use, because that way you can really focus in on what kinds of creatures are in this area in my world. And it's going to be much more customized and better fit your world than any pre-published table you're going to find. Also, you can control the possibilities. Maybe there's certain monsters you don't like. Like, for instance, me, I don't really like lycanthropes, werewolves and wereboars and all that crap. I really don't care for them. So unless I have a reason to use like a werewolf, like for a story I want to tell or something like that, and it's going to be more like a character, or I want to use them to foreshadow something, I almost never put lycanthropes on my random encounter tables because I just don't like using them. As far as why, I don't know. I'm just not into that. Like, even, like I read, urban fantasy sometimes, and like I watch horror movies sometimes, and I don't like movies about werewolves. I don't like reading stories about werewolves. It's just not my thing. I'm just not into it. So, you may be like that. You may be like, I hate shambling mounds. I don't like shambling mounds for whatever reason. So you just don't put them on your table. Or maybe you decide, certain kinds of creatures just don't exist in your world for whatever reason. So you don't put those on the table. Not every run-in with another creature counts as a random encounter. This is a good point too. Encounter tables don't usually include rabbits hopping through the undergrowth, harmless rats scurrying through dungeon halls, or average citizens walking through the streets of a city. Random encounter tables present obstacles and events that advance the plot, foreshadow important elements or themes of the adventure, and provide fun distractions. Now, I will say, I do that. So like, for instance, my Misty Wood encounter table, I have sub tables, and I have a sub table of that table that's just mundane animals. So there's I think it's like a result of like, cause I use percentile dice on my tables. So it's like something like a 3% chance, like a roll of 1 to 3 is you encounter some kind of mundane animal. And then I roll on, assuming I rolled, I roll on the mundane animal table to determine what that is. Yeah, obviously that's not probably going to be a combat encounter. And if it is, it's not going to be a very satisfactory one. But the reason I put mundane animals on my table is it's a reminder to me to describe those kinds of things. And it's also kind of a cheat sheet if I want to describe some kind of animal of some of the animals that are in the area. So I use that in that way just because for whatever reason, I find I tend to get caught up in what's going on in the game and I forget to describe stuff. So anything I can do to remind myself to describe the birds in the trees or the deer they see in the distance or something like that, I do. And I found that putting things like that on my table is just a way to remind me of, hey, there's mundane animals around too that they don't really interact with, but they're going to see. And hey, you might want to describe that once in a while. So I do put them on my table, but your mileage may vary. All right, so now let's talk about creating random encounter tables. Creating your own random encounter tables is straightforward. Determine the sort of encounters that might occur in a given dungeon area or a given wilderness area. Figure out the likelihood of a particular encounter occurring, then arrange the results. A quote encounter in this case could be a single monster or NPC, a group of monsters or NPCs, a random event like an earth tremor or a parade, or a random discovery like a charred corpse or a message scrawled on a wall. One thing they did in Tomb of Annihilation that I thought was really cool was they had a table for their random encounter table that was, I think they called them caches. And the idea was in the jungles of Chult, there's been many people in the past that have tried to explore the jungles of Chult. And the jungle is very dangerous. So there's a lot of explorers that have died exploring the jungle. So, when you're using that random encounter table, there's a chance that you have a quote encounter that's really maybe the remains of an explorer and it's the stuff that they had. Or it might be a cache that a explorer hid, like maybe a cache of healing potions that they're like, I'm going to hide this here and come back and get it later. And then they got killed and never came back and got it later. Which I really like that because it's also another way to give some treasure out to the player characters. And I only give treasure when I think it makes sense to give out treasure. And I've found it challenging to give out as much treasure as I want to, because a lot of, like for instance, in my campaign so far, a lot of the encounters that the players have had, it wouldn't really make sense for there to be any treasure. So a lot of the encounters haven't had any treasure, which has resulted in them not getting a lot of treasure. So I'm always on the lookout for believable ways to give them some treasure. So for instance, they, or you know what, I shouldn't say that. I was just about to spoil something. Let me just say they had an encounter with a creature that it would make sense to have a lot of treasure. And so that creature did have a lot of treasure. And it was a way for me to kind of catch up on giving them treasure. And the players were even like, whoa, this is a lot of stuff. And it's like, well, this creature would have a lot of stuff. It's like, it says right in the monster manual that they collect this kind of stuff. So, it made sense. And it was a way for me to reward them. And it was a way to get some stuff out there to the party that I wanted them to have. All right, so then you assemble your encounters. Once you've established a location through which the adventurers are likely to pass, be it a wilderness area or dungeon complex, make a list of creatures that might be found wandering there. If you're not sure which creatures to include, Appendix B has lists of monsters organized by creature type. And again, we've got actual encounter tables in Xanathar's Guide now. So for instance, for a sylvan woodland, you might create a table that includes centaurs, fairy dragons, pixies, sprites, dryads, satyrs, blink dogs, elks, owlbears, treants, giant owls, and a unicorn. If elves inhabit the forest, the table might also include elf druids and elf scouts. So yeah, remember you can use NPCs too. Of course, I don't so much do that in Primordia because for the most part, you don't find members of the quote civilized races traveling around in the wilds because it's too dangerous. But in more normal worlds, that's definitely a possibility. Perhaps gnolls are threatening the woods, so adding gnolls and hyenas to the table would be a fun surprise for the players. And again, that would be a clue to them that, hey, there's a gnoll presence here. This wasn't just random that you found this group of gnolls. You found a group of gnolls because there's actually quite a few gnolls in the area. Might want to look into that. Another fun surprise would be a wandering predator, such as a displacer beast that likes to hunt blink dogs. So yeah, think about stuff like that. Oh, well, if I have blink dogs, then there's probably going to be displacer beasts because they hunt blink dogs. Usually where you find one, you find the other. Makes sense. The table could also use a few random encounters of a less monstrous nature, such as a grove of burned trees, the handiwork of the gnolls, for instance, an ivy-covered elven statue, and a plant with glowing berries that turn creatures invisible when ingested. And these can be great ways to, again, get across the themes of your world, to make it seem magical, like in the case of the glowing berries, maybe to provide clues or even treasure. Maybe there's some treasure hidden under that elven statue. Or maybe there's something carved into it that could be a clue. Like maybe orcs came by and carved like the symbol for their band in it. And it could be a clue that there's orcs around, something like that. When choosing monsters for a random encounter table, try to imagine why the monsters would be encountered outside their lairs. Why are they out here? What is each monster up to? Is it on patrol, hunting for food, searching for something? Also consider whether a creature is moving stealthily as it travels through the area. And, if it's a dangerous area, probably most creatures will be moving stealthily. Like, most animals are being as quiet as they can, whether they're prey or predator. So, I think it's appropriate for most encounters in wilderness to just assume that everybody's trying to be as quiet as they can and use those, passive stealth scores and passive perception scores or call for rolls as needed. As with planned encounters, random encounters, or flexible encounters, are more interesting when they happen in memorable locations. Outdoors, the adventurers might be crossing a forest clearing when they encounter a unicorn, or be pushing through a dense section of forest when they come across a nest of spiders. Crossing a desert, characters might discover an oasis haunted by wights or a rocky outcropping on which a blue dragon perches. And I mentioned the new Unearthed Arcana on wilderness exploration. And one thing that was really cool that Mike Merles did in that is he suggested for any region that you create, making an actual table, almost like a random encounter table, making an actual table of different features one might see in the landscape. And then when you have an encounter, you can either roll or choose something from that table to make it interesting. So I thought that was a really cool idea. So you might, if it's a forest, you might put like a strangely twisted tree or a small pond or, ruins of an old settlement or whatever. So you can think of these things ahead of time and kind of make a list. And then when you have an encounter, you can pull something from that list to make it some kind of interesting location. So that's a cool trick too. And then we get to the probabilities. What are the chances that a given encounter are going to happen, assuming, of course, that you're going to roll for them randomly? So you can create your random encounter table in a lot of different ways. For instance, you can make it really simple. Roll 1d6 for one of 6 possible encounters. And again, think about probability. So in that example, you have equal odds of getting any one of those 6 encounters, right? They're equal. Or you could do something more complicated, like roll percentile dice, modify for the time of day, and cross-index the modified number with the dungeon level. Yeah, you can make it as simple or complicated as you want. So they give us a sample table here on page 87 of Sylvan Forest encounters. And what they did is they used a range of 2 to 20, 19 entries total, which they generate by rolling a D12 and a D8. And the reason they do this is this makes a curve of probability where the results in the middle of that range of 2 to 20 are more likely to occur than the results on the outside, like 2 or 20. So a roll of 2 or 20 is rare, about a 1% chance of either, while each of the rolls from 9 to 13 occur a little over 8% of the time. So if you are going to make a table that you're going to roll randomly on, you can control, what are the odds of a given result happening. And if you want a curve, if you want a bell curve, if you don't want every result to be equally possible, then a great way to do that is to roll multiple dice, like, a D8 and a D12 or 2D20 or whatever you want to do. I'm kind of mystified why they don't use percentile dice, because it's actually a lot easier. Because, you have to kind of understand the odds and how they relate to the dice, and do some math to figure out, okay, if I roll a D8 and a D12, what are the odds of getting a result of 9? Like, you have to do a little figuring to figure that out. And some people may not even understand how to do that, which would not be unreasonable. I personally, I'd probably have to sit down and think about it for a minute to figure out how to do that. I couldn't just blab it out to you right now. So using percentile dice is a whole lot easier because it's equal, right? If I want a 30% chance for a given encounter to happen, I just give it a range of 30 on the percentile dice. So this happens between a 1 and a 29 would be, or a 1 and a 30 would be a 30% chance, right? It's so easy. So I don't know why they complicate it this way. I don't know why they don't want to use percentile dice. It's kind of bizarre. But yeah, so if you roll percentile and you want something to have a 5% chance, you just give it 5 numbers on that percentile, like 5 to 10 or whatever, right? So that's how I'd recommend you do it. It's a lot easier. That's how I do my tables. And it gives you more variety too, because if you're using percentile, you can have things, and I have this on my table, there are things that only have a 1% chance of happening. They're going to be super rare. There are the things that have a 2 or a 3% chance happening. Now I can have things that have, any percentage I want to happen, right? Where if you're going to roll a D8 and a D12 or something like that, you're going to be limited in what those percentages can be. Where if you use a D100 or percentile dice, it can literally be any percentage from 1 to 100. So it's a lot easier to do it that way. I'm really mystified why they're taking this more convoluted, complicated route. I don't know. All right. So again, they have this sample table here that you can look at how they did it. And they do have some things on this table that are not monsters to fight, like a grove of burned trees, which actually on this table, there's a chance if they make a survival roll that the PCs can find tracks of gnolls that will lead them to a gnoll encounter. So that's a cool thing you can do. They can encounter some elf scouts, which presumably would not be hostile. The magical plant with glowing berries they talked about, a friendly treant. So yeah, don't limit yourself necessarily to just combat stuff, kind of think outside the box when you're coming up with these tables. And, I make tables too, even though I don't tend to roll on them, again, because for me, it's just a list of what the possibilities are. And I also, the rolls or the percentage of a given thing happening lets me know, okay, like for instance, if there's a 30% chance to get a goblin encounter on my tables, then that reminds me that there's a lot of goblins around here. Where if there's only a 1% chance to get a tyrannosaur, then that tells me that there's only a few tyrannosaurs or maybe only one. So that's how I use them. And finally, we can think about random encounter challenge. Random encounters need not be level appropriate challenges for the adventurers, but it's considered bad form to slaughter a party using a random encounter, since most players consider this ending to be an unsatisfying one. So let me clarify this, okay? I'm going to speak for wizards here, or speak for myself. I would amend this to say it would be bad form to kill the party with a random encounter that they cannot avoid or that they cannot solve in a way other than fighting it. That would be bad form. However, having a random encounter on your table that can easily kill the party, but you're going to allow them to find a creative way to either avoid it or to deal with it in a peaceful manner. It's not only is that not bad form, that's good form. That's the kind of gameplay I want, So for instance, and yeah, I believe this was on an episode released on the podcast already. The player characters encountered an ogre. They were 2nd level. They encountered an ogre. Now, I think personally, they probably could have taken it. I think if they would have fought the ogre, they probably could have defeated it. But ogres do a lot of damage, and second level characters don't have a lot of hit points, and I do have a wizard in the party, so there's a chance that one or more of them could have died, even if they defeated the ogre. Now, for me to have them encounter that ogre or have them encounter the Tyrannosaurus Rex and do it in such a way that there's no way they can avoid it, yeah, that would have been bad for them. It's just basically like, I'm going to kill your characters, basically. But the way I did it, there were options. So they had high enough perception, they had high enough passive perception that they heard the ogre before they stumbled upon it. I intentionally had the ogre making noise so they could hear it. One of the characters went ahead to see what the noise was. They saw the ogre and they got to make a decision. Are we going to go fight this ogre? Are we going to go try to talk to the ogre? Are we going to just avoid the ogre entirely? So at that point, all bets are off. I mean, it's in the player's hands. If they decide to go fight the ogre and the ogre kills them all, that's fine. That's the game. That's how the game is played. There's nothing wrong with that. But I gave them a choice, right? And they discussed it. And some of the players wanted to go talk to the ogre because they were trying to find this village. And they're like, hey, the ogre probably knows where the village is. But some of the other players were like, well, I don't think the ogre is going to talk to us. I think if we go to try to talk to it, it's going to turn into a fight. I don't think we can take an ogre, not without some of us dying at least. So let's just avoid the ogre altogether. And that's what they did. They made stealth checks and they circumvented the ogre. They gave it a wide berth and they avoided the encounter. And I even gave them some XP for it because they still overcame that obstacle that I put in their path, which is, hey, there's a big ogre here. What are you going to do? And they had more options than just charge in and try to kill it, which I think that's how a good game is run. So I wish they would have made that clarification because they're making it sound like, oh, you shouldn't put things on your encounter table that the PCs can't beat. And that's not true. You totally can. Just, give them an opportunity to find another solution. Now they may not take that opportunity. They may charge in and get themselves killed. And if that's the case, then that's player agency. Player agency isn't just, we get to choose the good things that are going to happen to our characters. It's also, you get to choose the bad things that are going to happen to your character. So if you're going to have agency in the world, part of that is you have to take responsibility to assess your threats. If you have agency and you decide to fight something you can't take, then your agency is going to lead to your character's demise. And I'm not going to take away your agency by stepping in and doing some deus ex machina to save your ass. You got yourself into it, get yourself out of it, or, roll a new character. It's up to you. Player agency for the win. All right. Not all random encounters with monsters need to be resolved through combat. A first level party of adventurers could have a random encounter with a young dragon circling above a forest canopy in search of a quick meal. But the character should have the option to hide or bargain for their lives if the dragon spots them. Which, again, this is kind of what I've been saying, right? So you can still have these encounters with things way beyond them, but give them other options. But, let them make the choice. If they want to choose the wrong thing, if they want to be stupid, let them be stupid. Let them learn from their mistakes. Similarly, the party might encounter a stone giant roaming the hills, but it might have no intention of harming anyone. But yet, if they charge and attack it, it's going to defend itself, right? Again, player agency, consequences. In fact, it might shy away from the party because of its reclusive nature. The giant might attack only characters who annoy it. So if they annoy it, then it attacks them, and then the gloves are off. That said, a random encounter table usually includes hostile, though not necessarily evil, monsters that are meant to be fought. The following monsters are considered appropriate combat challenges. A single monster with a challenge rating equal to or lower than the party's level. Now, again, here, I'll amend this to say that's, you can go beyond that. I found, especially if your player characters are freshly rested and they have all their spell slots and all their hit points, they can often handle something of a higher CR than their level. But you'll figure that out. You'll learn that through experience, what they can handle and what they can't. But if you want to be safe, limit it to a CR equal to their level or less. A group of monsters whose adjusted XP value constitutes an easy, medium, or hard challenge for the party, as determined using the encounter building guidelines earlier in this chapter, which we discussed extensively in the last episode in the series. And there we are. Not only have we gotten through the random encounter section, we have gotten through chapter 3 of the DMG. So next time we crack this bad boy open, we're going to be talking about chapter 4, creating non-player characters. That's going to be a fun one. So yeah, there's what the DMG has to say about random encounters, how to use them, when to use them, why you might want to use them, and as well as my own thoughts and my own perspectives on the way I approach them, which is a bit different than what's presented in the DMG. And ultimately, you're going to find your own approach. You might do it the way I do it. You might do it the way the DMG says to do it. You might come up with something of your own that's different than either of those. And that's great. You know, at the end of the day, it's your game. They're your players. Nobody knows better than you what's going to work best at your table for your players. So, you know, these are just thoughts and ideas that you can take or reject as you see fit. But I think between, you know, what's said here in the DMG and kind of what I've added to the discussion, I think you have the tools that you need to make random or flexible encounters work for you in your game and have a lot of fun with them. So let me know what you think about this. If you have a different approach to random encounters or flexible encounters than what we discussed today, I'd love to hear how you do it. And you know, if I hear something especially interesting or insightful, maybe I'll share it in a future episode. Another great place to talk about this would be on our new forum, and that way other people in the community can see what you have to say, and maybe we'll get a discussion about how different GMs use random encounters. And finally, if you are a GM who, for whatever reason, refuses to use them, I would encourage you to step back, step outside of yourself a little bit, reevaluate, think about what's been said today, and think if maybe you have a missed opportunity here. Maybe there's a tool that you haven't been using because you thought it could only be used a certain way. And maybe there's a different way you can use this tool that will work for you and work for your group. And if you're one of those GMs who up until now has said, I don't do random encounters for whatever reason, and you figure out a way to do something with this idea of a flexible encounter and make it work for you, I'd love to hear from you. Kind of the tale of your journey. You know, this is why I never used them. And this is, you know, these are the thoughts I've had after listening to this episode, and this is how I've started using them. And then, you know, let us know if that worked for you or not. I think that would be some really great insight for other listener GMs. And again, you know, there's no right or wrong answers that are going to work for everybody. You know, at the end of the day, what the right answer is what works best for you. And as long as you're having fun, as long as the players are having fun, then it's all good. But, you know, I think part of being a GM for a lot of us, if not all of us, is finding ways to hone our craft and to become better GMs and to tell even better stories and run even better game sessions than we have in the past. And that's kind of the whole point of this show. So, you know, one way that we can try to do that is by sharing our ideas and looking at the way other GMs do things and seeing what we can learn, seeing if maybe there's some tricks of the trade that we can add to our GM toolbox. All right, well, that's going to wrap up episode 207 of Game Master's Journey. Really quickly, I want to give a shout out and a thank you to Hal Packren from Australia. I hope I said your name right. And Hal left a very nice 5-star review on iTunes. Hal says, I've been listening to Lex for a while. His shows are always polished, near perfect audio, and he knows what he is talking about when it comes to role-playing. You don't have to be a D&D player to learn something. We've had a similar role-playing experience and longevity, and I always learn something every time I listen. So thank you so much, Hal. And it's great to hear from a GM who's been at this as long as I am, or I have been, who is learning from the show as well, because that really reinforces my belief that no matter how long you've been doing this, no matter who you are, no matter how good you are, you can still learn from other GMs, even less experienced GMs, and grow and improve. And that's what we're all trying to do. If you would like to get a hold of me, you can email me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter @LexStarWalker, and you can call the Game Masters Journey voicemail and leave me a message. If your question or feedback is entertaining or enlightening, or both, you might even hear that message on the show. The phone number is 951-GMJ-LEX1. That's 951-465-5391. Or you can find all that contact information in the show notes. You can find the show notes for this and all the episodes at starwalkerstudios.com/GameMastersJourney, as well as links to connect with the Game Masters Journey community on our forum, Google+, and Discord, where you can share ideas, questions, and your stories with other listener GMs. Oh, and our forum, by the way, we have a special section just for world building where you can share your worlds that you've created with other GMs. And we've had a few GMs on there already sharing stuff, and it's great stuff. So check that out. If you have comments, questions, or feedback for the show, I would love to hear from you. If you enjoy Game Master's Journey and you'd like to help support the show, you can find all the ways to do so at starwalkerstudios.com/support. I've even got some options for you that won't cost any money. The best way, of course, that you can support the show and my RPG endeavors is to check out my self-published adventure, The Trickster's Labyrinth. If you'd like to show off your support for Game Master's Journey, you could also get a Game Master's Journey t-shirt or a Trickster's Labyrinth t-shirt. The shirts were designed by my wife, Nikki, and they're gorgeous. However you decide to support the show, I really appreciate it. I hope that you have a chance to play your favorite RPG this week. I hope you have a chance to run your favorite RPG. I'll be back soon with another episode of Game Master's Journey. Until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music, courtesy of Cloudwalker, Transboy, Renfield, Stanko, and Ish. See the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/GameMastersJourney.